Taya, can we start? Okay. Okay, it's exactly 6 o'clock our time. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome again to the Oxford Interfaith Forum reading groups on sacred literature in an interfaith context. This is the third in a series of reading groups devoted to sacred literature, and we've chosen the topic of Revelation, but we have interpreted that very broadly indeed. With many apologies to those of you who have already heard my introduction, I would like to briefly recap what I've said in introducing our previous speakers, for those of you who didn't attend previous sessions in this series. Sacred literature of all faiths is distinguished from the non-sacred, not really by any criteria of style or literary form, but because of its divine origin, which sets it apart from other literature and makes it more authoritative than any other writings. As the Book of Common Prayer has it, the words of Scripture are given by God so that we may hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them. There's also a body of supplementary literature and liturgy that is theoretically less sacred, but still has a crucial relationship with the sources. What this series of reading groups is trying to do is to discuss all these texts with attention to their qualities as literary masterpieces, in addition to their eternal value as sacred texts. Literature, of course, is a huge and varied topic, even more than Revelation. All these texts use literary techniques and devices, for example, poetry, narrative, parables, figures of speech, characterizations, imagery, among many other devices. This can be within the framework of the aesthetics of the sacred texts themselves, or in relation to other literary, even modern texts, as we saw in the first lecture in this series. But in addition to their manifold literary qualities, we aim to consider how exegetical usages of these works have been changed and developed, how they've been used in different and maybe even secular contexts, how religious and literary texts interact and influence each other. We also explore the processes of appropriation and reinterpretation of teachings and practices of other religions as a form of textual dialogue, as we heard in Professor Barton's lecture. There is a multitude of other topics within our framework, which I hope will be explored in future sessions. And now it is my greatest pleasure and honor to introduce our third speaker in this series, Professor Raymond Scheindlin. Trained in Arabic literature at Columbia University and in Hebrew literature at the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Turn my page. Professor Scheindlin was, until his retirement in 2016, Professor of Medieval Hebrew Literature at the Seminary, that's in New York, having previously taught at McGill and Cornell Universities. He was ordained as a rabbi in 1965. Professor Scheindlin is a specialist in pre-modern Hebrew literature and a translator of Hebrew poetry. His main field of research is the encounter of Hebrew and Arabic cultures in Spain, especially as embodied in the poetry of the two traditions. He has published a huge number of academic articles on Hebrew literature in its medieval golden age, largely dealing with the interplay between the Hebrew and Arabic literary traditions. His books centering on verse translations include Wine, Women, and Death, medieval Hebrew poems on the good life, The Gazelle, medieval Hebrew poems on God, Israel, and the soul, and the Book of Job. His study of the 12th century pilgrim, Yehuda Halevi, entitled The Song of the Distant Dove, Judah Halevi's Pilgrimage, which was published in 2007, includes many of Halevi's greatest poems in translation and a detailed narrative of Halevi's journey. Professor Scheindlin's book, Vulture in a Cage, Poems by Solomon ibn Gabirol, the 11th century poet with whom Professor Scheindlin says he strongly identifies, which I find very intriguing, was published in 2016. Professor Scheindlin has been a visiting professor at the Hochschule für Jüdische Studien in Heidelberg and at Harvard University. He's a former Guggenheim and Cullman Fellow, as well as a recipient of the Cultural Achievement Award of the National Foundation for Jewish Culture. He now lives with his wife in New York City and Bethel, New York. The title of his presentation today is The Revelation at Sinai in Early Synagogue Poetry. Mr. Scheindlin.
Thank you, Glenda, for that very kind introduction. And I'm very pleased and honored to be part of this group. I've listened to a few of the sessions in the past few months, and I always find them very interesting and revelatory. Speaking of revelatory, our topic today is revelation at Sinai in early synagogue poetry. Now, the revelation at Sinai is commemorated in the Jewish liturgical calendar on the festival of Shavuot, which takes place in the spring, 50 days after the beginning of Passover. The Torah speaks of the festival of Shavuot as a celebration of harvest, the harvest of the first fruits. It was originally intended to be an
Professor Scheindlin, yes, you mute yourself, excuse me. Can you, yes. Thank you.
I must have gotten tired of hearing myself talk. To go back, the ancient rabbis made a very careful reading of the chronology of the events in Exodus, and that led them to believe that the 50th day after the second day of Passover was the day of revelation on Mount Sinai, calculated to be the 6th of the Hebrew month of Sivan. So Shavuot shifted character from being an agricultural festival to being a commemoration of the revelation at Sinai. And that is how it is described in all rabbinic sources, the Talmud and Midrash. Now, the liturgy for Shavuot, you may be surprised to find out, only includes very sparse references to its character. There is a phrase that appears in the liturgy several times, this festival of weeks, the time of the giving of the Torah. And the prescribed Torah reading for the festival of Shavuot is the narrative of Sinai and the reading of the Decalogue. Other than that, the standard liturgy doesn't really have any reference to the character of the holiday. Now, the Talmud and Midrash, the classic rabbinic sources of rabbinic Judaism, contain a great deal of material about the events at Sinai. But the typical way these sources work is that they take individual verses from the Bible and elaborate on them in accordance with whatever message a particular rabbi wanted to convey. And some of those elaborations are that rabbi's reflection on the meaning of an individual passage or some moral preaching that he wanted to read into that passage. Sometimes there will be a little narrative element in the comment. There may be even the germs of a story. Or sometimes the comments on the passages are simply fanciful. But no ancient rabbi ever tried, as far as we know, to construct a consecutive narrative out of the fragmentary commentaries on the passages in Exodus that have to do with Revelation. The interpretations of these bits of narrative are mostly preserved in the form of verse-by-verse commentaries, and by nature, they're fragmented and sporadic. But we do have ancient poems that compile traditions about Revelation, traditions that arose in the rabbinic world, that compile such traditions into large-scale literary works that are designed to describe, evoke, or even recreate the experience of the revelation. These texts are not exactly coherent narratives, but they are complex literary structures that draw on the exegetical and didactic tradition, including their narrative elements, to create a literature that is not didactic like rabbinic literature, but like standard rabbinic literature, but is evocative and affective. These poems and poetic structures go by the generic name of piyut, which we may translate as liturgical poetry. The Hebrew word piyut derives from the same Greek word as the English word poet or poetry. These poems supplement the routine liturgy with texts that are specifically related to the occasion on which the liturgy is performed. And in the case of the poems on Shavuot, they're designed to supply what's lacking in the regular liturgy, to stress what's distinctive about that particular festival, and to create an atmosphere in which a congregation could draw closer to the events that are described in the somewhat confusing narrative in Exodus. The piyutim combine narrative, exegetical, and lyrical elements into texts that are designed to be convincing, evocative, atmospheric, moving. They were created for the sake of their affective power rather than for any pedagogical purpose. So in that way, they are the affective counterpart to the didactic literature of Talmud and Midrash. Now, the Piyut texts that I want to speak of today are large cycles of liturgical poetry. I'm trying to give you as few technical terms as possible. This is a field that can be really bewildering, but I have to use a few terms. And the one term that I'm going to keep coming back to is kedushta, plural kedushtaot. These are large cycles of liturgical poems that are woven into the synagogue service, with individual poems or groups of poems inserted into particular parts of the standard service according to rules and patterns that don't concern us. When I used to teach this subject occasionally at the Jewish Theological Seminary, I would have to fill a blackboard with technical terms and spend 45 minutes trying to explain the outline of this. But fortunately, we're only dealing with subject matter. We don't need to deal with forms today. So I'm not going to have to do that. The most prominent authors of full-fledged kedushtaot in the period of the consolidation of the Talmud and Midrashic literature were Yanai and Kalir, who must have been active in the 6th and 7th centuries in Palestine. They were supposedly master and disciple. Yanai was the master, and he has supposedly killed his disciple Kalir by putting a scorpion in his sandal out of jealousy over his accomplishment in creating these very complicated kedushtaot. With a study group that I participate in the other day, I recently read about, just yesterday in fact, recently read about the competition between Arachne and Minerva in weaving. So I have a little insight into that from Ovid. Anyway, Kalir wrote kedushtaot for all the major festivals. And these may be seen, I mean, there's a way of looking at these as textbooks that lay out how official rabbinic Judaism, at the end of its formative period, thought about landmark events of the Jewish calendar, or at least how one major representative of that literature did. They are not ordinarily brought into studies of the rabbinic mind and worldview, which always surprises me. It's not that they're neglected works. Kalir's kedushtaot were recited by Italian and Ashkenazi Jews from the times those communities came into being in the Middle Ages until they were nearly eliminated by prayer book reformers in the 19th century. They stare us in the face in the standard prayer books printed in Germany and Russia as late as the early 20th century, begging us to investigate them and give them their place as primary sources for the study of rabbinic literature. And the neglect of these texts is not hard to understand. As liturgy, however effective they were in late antiquity and the Middle Ages, they are so long and complicated and difficult that they could not survive the modernization of the liturgy that began in 19th century Germany and that has affected even Orthodox congregations today. They're written in an exceedingly recondite register of Hebrew. I thought I might just show you a page. I guess you can see this. Here's a page of the Kedushta that we're going to be talking about today. You see the text of the poem is on the top half of the page, and the entire bottom half of the page is explanatory notes by the editor. And the entire poem requires that kind of detailed commentary, even for the experienced reader to be able to follow. The academic question that's usually asked of these poems is whoever understood them. Unfortunately, that is usually the last question, and it's one that I don't intend to deal with today. Whether or not they were understood, they were copied and recopied to the point that thousands of manuscripts and manuscript fragments have survived, and they were recited and included in prayer books used by millions of Jews for many centuries, and by small numbers even to this day, whether they understand them or not. So today I want to focus on Kalir's Kedushtaot for Shavuot. We have 3 such Kedushtaot and fragments of a few others. Like most Kedushtaot, they're made up of 9 poems each. I can't deal with their poetic style, rhyme, meter, and diction because we're limited to translations. In any case, I don't think they've ever been translated into English. What I do want to show you is how Kalir's Kiddush Ta'ot represent revelation at Sinai to Jewish worshipers, and how he wanted worshipers to experience the memory of the revelation at Sinai. I will draw mostly on the Kiddush Ta that is found in the Ashkenazic prayer book, and refer occasionally to the others that are known only from manuscripts. All the translations that I'm using are my own and have been made specifically for this presentation. So let's start with 4 themes that stand out in the Kiddush Ta'ot for Shavuot. Then we'll take up the central poem of the group, which is an elaborate preparation for the reading of the Decalogue. So the 4 big themes. The first, and it's pervasive in all the Kiddush Ta'ot, is the sheer terror of the revelatory experience. Now, the Bible itself says, on the 3rd day, there were noises and lightning and a heavy cloud on the mountain and the great sound of a horn, and all the people in the camp were afraid. That's how the story of the revelation, that's right before the actual reciting of the Decalogue. And then it says, and all the people saw the sounds and the flares and the mountain smoking, and they were afraid and stood afar off. So even in the Bible, the revelation is accompanied by phenomena of nature that are frightening to the people who were there. But our poem begins, the earth shook and trembled. In the 3rd month it erupted. Its inhabitants were in turmoil for their lives when it saw its beloved and quaked, its beloved being God. The highest God let out a roar, and torches of glowing coals burst into flame. Light-footed lightning flew, the angelic wheels thundered, the horn blasted on high, the God-pounded earth nearly cracked. Nations were seized with pains, a storm of birth pangs and agony. They wailed like a laboring woman. The fixed mountains jumped about. Okay, he elaborates on the tremendous natural phenomena that occurred. What interests me is that he takes it away from the local experience of Mount Sinai and makes it a universal phenomenon. There's nothing local about this upheaval and terror. This was universal upheaval at the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai. So that's one point that keeps recurring in these poems. Then another that occurs not pervasively, but enough that we can see that it's of importance to Kalir, and that is the angels resist bestowing the Torah on mere mortals. Like, who are mortals to receive this revelation? I'll read you a little passage. From the mountain to his heavenly dwelling, God urgently summoned Moses the humble, sanctified him 7 days in his clouds, and brought him in to explain matters to him. When the faithful leader was brought to the house, he rejoiced to capture the Torah, the lovely one of the house. But while he was still at the entrance to the house, the angels locked the house against him. They said, "What is mortal man to be mentioned on high, to bring down the splendor of trust from above?" He went forward and overcame them and was elevated on high. God bade his emissary ascend, and he ascended. So the angels resisted letting the Torah go to mortals, which they don't think are worthy. This is a familiar theme in rabbinic literature. It appears in Talmud and Midrash in many variations. Moses argues with the angels and convinces them to let him have the Torah. Moses appeals to God, and God orders them to let him have the Torah, or God argues with the angels and shows them that they have no need of it. Here's another variation of the story in another poem by Kalir. When Moses encountered the dark clouds of heaven to snatch the divine wisdom as healing for the earth, God's footstool, the roaring angels barred his way so that a mortal should not capture God's delight. They made their coals and their flaming arrows flare. Covered by flame, he was escorted to them in heaven. He shrank when he saw their terrifying lightning flashes, when they flared their terrible flames against him. "Save yourself by taking hold of my throne," cried a voice to him. of one who appeared like the terrible ice. And when God spread his cloud, he took shelter in this refuge. Then he began his reply, and his speech shone forth. So in this version of the story, Collier tells us that God tells Moses to save himself from the terrifying angels by seizing hold of God's throne, and then God covers him with a cloud to protect him from the fire of the angels. But then Moses speaks forth and argues with the angels in the following verses that I'm not going to read to you, but I think you get the idea that there's many versions of this theme of resistance to mere mortals having the Torah, and God always overrules it, or Moses has the power to overrule it. The people who receive the revelation, third theme, the people who receive the revelation were not just the Israelites who escaped from Egypt, but all future generations. Collier puts it this way: and every generation and their leaders who arose before them and who arose after them, all of them he made to stand at Sinai with them. The splendor of, or God addresses Moses and says, the splendor of your two stones, that is the two tablets of the law, the splendor of your two stones and what they held in store, 500 generations and their descendants, their exegesis and their narration, their cantillation and their assemblies who hear them, the images of creatures and their destinies, they're all contained in the two tablets of the law. The fourth point that I want to stress is the content of the revelation. It begins with point 3, but extending beyond it, the content of the revelation is much more than the 10 Commandments. Collier several times refers to the thing revealed at Sinai as the threefold, which is generally understood to mean the entire Bible, since the Bible in the Jewish tradition is organized into 3 parts: the Torah, the prophets, and the hagiographa. Further, the Torah revealed to Moses included all of the rabbinic tradition, the oral law, and all the interpretations that future rabbis would eventually apply to the text of Scripture. It's all there in the 2 tablets. The way Collier puts it is, they received the Torah on Mount Sinai, not spoken by an angel or a messenger, but from the mouth of the king robed in light, whose eyes are pure, whose awe is pure, from the mouth of the Almighty, who taught his chosen ones the law, all clearly laid out in speech and words, commandments and prohibitions, Talmud, homilies, Mishnah, biblical text, with the laws of the entire covenant, well laid out and well preserved, with every commandment in its proper order, so that he who gave the Torah will be blessed daily by those who study it, saying, blessed is he who gave the Torah. Now, this little liturgical allusion puts you in mind of the ordinary rabbinic type Jew who begins his day before the prayers even by studying a little bit of the Torah and reciting the blessing to God, thanking God for giving the Torah. So the Torah itself includes by implication all the future study of the Torah that would ever be done. The revelation at Sinai has been expanded to include the entire Hebrew Bible and the entire system of rabbinic lore. But rabbinic tradition is embodied in texts that are ordinarily dialectical in form. The message, whether a law or a principle of behavior or belief, appears to be constantly emerging from argument and debate. The entire Talmud and Midrash is all back and forth between people who are trying to explicate texts, and the meaning emerges from their debates and arguments. Collier, on the other hand, presents it as all implicit in the revelation at Sinai, with all of its contradictions and all of its working out. It's all implicit in the revelation at Sinai, just as he presented the course of human history in Revelation as implicit in the revelation at Sinai, at least by implication. So these 4 points will give you a general idea of how Collier conceives of revelation. But now, in order to stress the more literary aspect of Collier's world, I want to focus on the central poem of the Kedushta, of the main Kedushta that I'm speaking of, which I'm calling Kedushta number 1, the central poem, which is the 6th poem in the cycle. In the center of Kedushta 1, Kalir offers us a poem that is actually a masterpiece of the synagogue poet's art. Given its position at the very center of the cycle, given its length and its linguistic virtuosity, which I can't replicate in English, we can infer that it contains the main message of the Kedusha and the main emotional experience that the poet wants the listener to come away with. In this poem, the Torah is strikingly personified and turned into a mythic figure, a female voice telling the story of her interactions with God. And in this poem, we lose sight of Sinai almost entirely. The Torah speaks to us of a time long preceding the creation of the world. The theme is not Kalir's invention, but his manner of working it out. And this, and particularly in Kedusha 1, but in Kedusha 2 as well, to a maybe slightly less forcibly, make it clear that this theme is central to his conception of revelation. The poem consists of two parts. The first part, the Torah personified, speaks in a female voice, telling us that she existed long before the world was created and that she was God's partner in creating the world. And in the second part, the Torah reports her discussion with God as to when would be the right moment for her to be revealed to mankind. Generations come and go, and each is rejected for one reason or another. But 2,448 years after the creation of the world, the Torah decides that the time is now, and Moses is the one to be the instrument of revelation. I regret to have to confess that early in this second part, the speaker shifts from being the Torah to the voice of a third-person narrator. I wish this weren't the case, but so it is. Unfortunately, there's one little bit of preamble that you need before I can read you selections from poem 6. The poem assumes that you're familiar with the book of Proverbs, chapter 8, verses 22 to 32. In this passage, the speaker is wisdom personified. But Kalir has taken his cue from the fact that Proverbs personifies wisdom, and wisdom speaks about her own pre-existence. The passage begins as follows: "The Lord possessed me in the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I was set up from everlasting, from the beginning, or ever the earth was. Then I was by him, as one brought up with him, and I was daily his delight, rejoicing always before him, rejoicing in the habitable part of the world, and my delights were with the sons of men." Well, the speaker is wisdom, but the rabbinic tradition, of course, understood wisdom in Proverbs as the Torah, and Kalir's poem assumes this. The poem contains a stanza for each hemistich in the passage from Proverbs. Each stanza begins with one hemistich of the passage in Proverbs and then elaborates on it in monorhymed lines that rhyme with it. Here's the first stanza of the poem. "The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way." That's the line from Proverbs. Now, rhyming with this is, 2,000 years I dwelt sweetly in his bosom, before he measured out the world's breadth and length, before he stretched out the high heavens, all that while, before he established his chariot, his car, I took delight in being fondled on his knees, rejoicing in his inhabited world when he created me, rejoicing before him, praising and blessing him, proclaiming to all that there is none like him. I was nurtured in the care of the Lord, rejoicing before him every day, rejoicing down to this very day. So here are some points raised by stanza 1. The Torah speaks in the first person, a feminine voice, and she is upbeat. Her lines are short and monorhymed with lots of anaphora. The stanza ends with a monorhymed tercet in a contrasting rhyme. The stanza combines Proverbs' image of wisdom pre-existing the world with the rabbinic notion that the Torah existed 2,000 years before the creation of the world. You might wonder what is meant by God's chariot in that passage before he established his chariot. Well, that is a rich word in Hebrew liturgical poetry. God's chariot refers to his throne, and we have a series of mystical texts that show that many of the ancients were obsessed with the idea of God's throne, brooded on it, meditated on it, tried to picture it, tried to imagine the hymns that the angels dancing around it sang, and so forth. Kalir doesn't go in that direction in this particular poem. There are others in which he deals with that theme. Right now, he just mentioned it in passing. The phrase nurtured in the care of the Lord needs also a little bit of comment. The Hebrew phrase is va'heyeh etzlo amon, which is problematic. The rabbinic tradition understood amon as being master craftsman, and there is a way to justify that, which it has to do with the idea that, well, one of the great classic rabbinic texts, Genesis Rabbah, begins with the image of God looking into the Torah as a blueprint and creating the world from the blueprint there. Kalir here takes this to another step, as you'll see in a moment, that he understands I was God's Amon as if it means that the Torah was God's, in some way, God's co-creator of the world. Like the rest of the poem, this stanza is linguistically very dense, and the core idea doesn't develop a great deal from line to line. And the same can be said for much of the rest of the poem. But it does establish very strongly this feminine and audible voice of the Torah speaking to us. The Torah preceded, according to poem 6, the Torah preceded not only the creation of the world, but also 7 things that are traditionally thought, 7 other things that are supposed to have preceded the world. Commenting on the second phrase, or ever the earth was, the poem goes on to say, 7 things preceded the world. The lofty throne, that is God's lofty throne, preceded the high heavens. The throne of Israel's kingdom preceded the kingdoms of the world. The patriarchs preceded the foundations of the earth. The name of the Messiah preceded the names of everything in the world. Paradise preceded the righteous of the world. Hell preceded the wicked of the world. Repentance preceded the people of the world. But I, that is the Torah, preceded all the earliest things of the world. Thus, the Torah not only preceded the world, but participated in its creation, which I mentioned briefly. Here are some quotations to establish that. Before one abyss called to the other, God's mouth summoned me. And when the abysses were split open through his knowledge, they were split open through my knowledge. And in the great abyss, I fulfilled my decree. I drew a limit and a boundary to the abysses, and I exulted in the sea monsters of the deep. Before the mountains were born, and I gave birth to the eternal hills. I gave birth to the hill when it rose high. When the hills were uplifted, I was elevated in justice. In this passage that I just read about being born, gave birth, repeated over and over again, the female character of the Torah is even more strongly stressed. Before, she was God's playmate, sitting on his knees, being fondled, enjoying his presence almost in sexual terms. Here, she is actually the mother. When he made the limits of the sea, I set my limit upon them. The waters do not go farther than he permits, or farther than I permit. And the world was perfected through the word of my mouth, for I was in his mouth. And in these passages, we see that the body of the Torah is physically connected with the body of the world. There's somehow a materiality to the Torah. that's connected to the materiality of the earth. The Torah is the material from which the world is made. In a stanza that I don't dare to try to translate it. I just didn't want to risk a translation. It's quite difficult, but I think that it needs to be understood as implying that there's a materiality, a material character to the Torah that is related to the material character of the earth. In other passages, God created the world for the sake of the Torah. That's a familiar rabbinic idea. The Torah contains the destiny of the world, the destiny of world leadership. The Torah is like water in its purifying powers. The heavens themselves are finite, but the Torah is not finite. In short, the Torah is mythologized and feminized, and even sometimes eroticized. It reminds me in some passages forcibly of the gods of the ancient Near East with their consorts. Reminds me that the pre-monotheistic Israelites worshipped or may have worshipped a female deity alongside Yahweh. I can't say, wouldn't dare to say that this is a direct survival of pre-monotheistic conception of a divine husband and wife team. Maybe is it the resurgence, maybe, of a tendency in the religious imagination that was suppressed a millennium earlier by the prophets and the idea of monotheism, but somehow resurfaces again. And I'm thinking of Shalom's view that suppressed mythology resurfaces in mysticism. And here it resurfaces not in mysticism, but in poetry. It would be it's an odd thing, but it seems to me that the rabbinic interpretation of the passage in Proverbs as being wisdom is purely literary in a way that this is not. This sounds like mythologizing it. It sounds like we have an actual character here with a personality and a real voice. In the second part of poem 6, God and the Torah discuss the timing of the revelation. The Torah says that on the day when the world was created, God summoned her and listed the leading men of the generations to come: Adam, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 tribes of Israel, and laid out the case for bestowing the Torah on each of them in turn. For each of them, the Torah raises an objection. The Torah waves each of these generations away. Here's the first stanza to give you an idea of what it's like. He summoned the holy tribes that were to be in the land, and the creator of the land questioned me about each. Adam stood forth, the first of all souls. This is the book of the generations of Adam. God said, he is full of wisdom. He resembles me in form and shape. He is like one of us, inspiring awe in the extreme. He is feared by the wild and domestic animals. I created them all in the land. And in his wisdom, he called them by name. And then he called me by my revered and awe-inspiring name. The Torah replied to the one God. When he was alone, and he lived in delight, but you said, it is not good for him to be alone. And a female figure was sliced off of one rib. He then transgressed 3 commands. Thou shalt not steal, the fruit of the tree, of course. Thou shalt not bear false witness. I guess the reference is to the woman seduced me so that I took the apple, or whatever the fruit was. He transgressed, thou shalt not covet. 3 of the 10 commandments transgressed by Adam in one speech. Therefore, he did not spend even a single night in glory. In other words, even a single night in paradise. And so Adam is rejected as being the one to receive the Torah. With the similar arguments, the Torah rejects each of the successive generations until it reaches Moses. All these were completed, and the eternal people came into being when 2,000 years had passed before the world was created, and 2,448 years had passed since the world was created. The Torah said, behold, here is Moses, who was called humble from eternity. And the Lord spoke to Moses, was inscribed in me from eternity. He will inherit me as an eternal bequest. He will take me as an eternal gift. And all who live in the world will believe in me forever. This stanza could have been the opportunity for the praise of Moses. I mean, that could have been expanded into much larger encomia, panegyric. But none of Moses's virtues are named. His story is not really told or alluded to. The claim seems to be that Moses was chosen simply because he's named in the Torah as the one to whom God repeatedly spoke. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, repeated over and over again. Because the Torah tells us that Moses was the one to whom it is entrusted. This reasoning sounds circular to us, but it makes sense in the logic of the poem. The world only exists because the Torah says it does. Mankind only exists because the Torah says it does. The Torah names Moses over and over as God's interlocutor, and therefore Moses is God's interlocutor. Moses was the vehicle because the Torah says so. By implication, Moses was destined from long before the creation of the world to be God's interlocutor. This point could have led to a mythologizing of Moses, which actually happened in the case of Muhammad on the Islamic side. But we're not talking about Islam today, but that's a whole really fascinating development in Islamic thought. But this point is never made explicit. And apart from this passage and the one about Moses' encounter with the angels, Moses is not the central figure of this composition, in accordance with his low profile in the liturgy in general. You might think that if any place in the liturgy would give Moses a place to stand out, it would be the revelation at Sinai. But just as he plays a very minimal role in the liturgy in general, so he plays a minimal role even at Sinai in the tradition of Hebrew liturgical poetry. There's one theme that is actually absent in Khalir's poem that I just want to mention because I'd like you to know about it, because its absence is striking if you're to one who's familiar with rabbinic texts, and that is the theme of Israel as God's bride, and the Torah is God's bride gift to Israel. He mentions it in passing in other poems, but not in this one. So that's just not his subject. So I think it's time for me to wrap this up and just make a little bit of a summary here. This is a very long and complicated cycle of poems, and there's much more that could be dealt with. In subsequent poems belonging to this Kedushta, Khalir elaborates on each of the 10 commandments, and he exploits the themes and terrors of Revelation to prepare the congregation for the recitation of the sentence, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts," from Isaiah, which is the climax of this part of the liturgy. This is the part of the liturgy for which the Kedushta is preparation, and indeed from which the word Kedushta gets its name, Kedusha, holiness. But enough has been said to give you a picture of the revelation of Sinai according to a major Hebrew poet from the classic age of rabbinic literature, and to see how he depicted the event at Sinai as a world-shaking revelation of a text that is animated and speaks in its own feminine voice, that embodies all the potentiality of its own interpretation, in fact, all the potentiality of creation itself, and how that poet depicted the revelation at Sinai as an event that dissolved time and brought all generations of mankind together to receive God's word. And now I've lost your image.
Sorry?
I've lost your connection, I think.
No, you're still there.
Am I? Okay, I can't see you, but I can hear you, so I guess that's all right.
Oh, you're there. We can see you. I think everybody can see you.
Well, that happened just at the right moment because that was the end of my presentation, my formal presentation.
Well, we would love to have you back because there'll be lots of questions and discussion, I'm sure.
I'm here vocally, and I'm trying to find you visually. There you are.
Oh, good. Wonderful.
You came back.
So you're back. That's wonderful to see you again. Well, thank you so much for that presentation. And I don't want to waste any time. I'm sure there are so many questions. If anybody would like to say something or to ask the questions, please put up, there's the little yellow hand icon, please. Or put your hands up because I can see you, most of you anyway. I'd ask a quick question, which is completely different from what's been asked up to now. You've stressed, and so Professor Inklin also stressed the fact that these are very obscure and not much used texts. But when the liturgy was used, because you indicated that at some time it was used, was it associated with any kind of music? Was there something in it to make it easier for the congregation to follow? Because they surely would not have had the kind of insights that you've been speaking about this evening.
Yeah, this is a very much thrashed about problem, but without too much illumination. There is a theory that in an early stage, the recitation of these was accompanied by choral singers. I personally find the evidence for it very, very weak, but many people are convinced. In any case, the evidence that's been cited would only relate to a very small subset of these poems. It doesn't seem, it's hard to see how it would apply to the bulk of them. So I think it's very weakly founded. Now, some of the poems, a lot of the poems have the kind of structure that would lend themselves to melodic performance. I mean, the texts that I've read to you today are not so much what I'm thinking of, but there are many, many hundreds actually that are organized in 4-line stanzas. And in the Western world, 4-line stanzas, fit, especially if the lines are not too long, fits into our natural pattern of Western music. And so in the Ashkenazic synagogues, many strophic piyutim have been set to folk tunes and are sung to this day. In fact, in synagogues where the bulk of the piyutim have been eliminated, a few of them have been retained because they have singable tunes. And you'll find this if you go into any moderately traditional synagogue on the high holidays. It turns out that the things that people remember from the service when they leave the synagogue are generally the singable piyutim, because the standard liturgy mostly isn't organized in strophic form. It's not usually singable. But so choirs will perform them, congregations will pick up the tunes, and to that extent, this liturgy still survives. But the bulk of it isn't that way. The bulk of it is these long, excruciatingly difficult texts that, and those, I don't know how they were. I don't know how they were done in the Middle Ages, to tell you the truth. As far as I know, there's very little concrete evidence for how they were done. How they're done in most synagogues where they are still done is the congregation simply mumbles them. I mean, there's no attention is paid to their poetic form at all. But they all have poetic form. They're all, in fact, they have strict poetic form. Once the poet decides on how he wants a stanza to be organized, all the stanzas will be organized that way. That a great deal of attention has gone in to making these things into verse. Whether we can call it poetry is another thing with our romantic conception of what poetry should be. But these things were designed to be emotionally effective. And so they are, in principle, they could be singable. But how they were sung in the Middle Ages, there's no concrete evidence for that as far as I know. There's one example of a liturgical poem for which we have musical notation. It's from a 13th century text that was copied by a monk who converted to Judaism. And he attached neumes to it. It's a very short text. Unfortunately, it's only a few lines. And he attached the symbols of the chant, of church chants to them to indicate that was how he understood that it was to be sung. That's one text from one place by one person in Italy who was himself a latecomer to Judaism. Who knows whether the texts were actually sung that way or whether it was his idea of how it might be a good idea to sing. So, and musicologists have attempted to reconstruct the chant that lies behind this manuscript. You can get on YouTube and listen to a few different renditions of it. But it's, as far as I know, the only evidence there is for the singing of these things. And yet they must have been chanted at least at least a leader had to have chanted them. And some of them have refrains which suggest that a congregation sang them.
I see. Well, thank you. Well, I'm afraid we have reached the end. I'm very sorry that we have to stop now, but I would like to thank Professor Scheindlin very, very much for the most, well, I don't have to say the most enlightening and illuminating and very lively discussion of this very difficult liturgy. I think it almost makes one want to go and have a look at it. Not that I would do much, but still it gives to the sense that you want to really know much more of what it's all about. So
I give lessons.
Yeah, sure. On Zoom, we can do everything. Thank you so much, Ray, for the really wonderful presentation. It's so great for this series. It's wonderful to end the series in this way. Thank you so much for the time.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, and thanks for your attention, everyone.
Oh, it's been
and a few people who are on this. I know whom I know, but haven't seen for many years. Thank you for checking in. Pleasure to see you.
I'm sure they're all very pleased to be here. I'm very happy to have heard your presentation today. And thank you so much again. And I hope we'll see you back here again, because there will be future series, and I hope you'll come back again and do some more on liturgy, on Midrash, on anything you would like. So thank you all for coming, and it's lovely to see you, and I hope we'll see you again. Thanks very much, and thank you, Chair. Good night, everybody.